I okay. I'm I'm finally back. I apologize for that. I don't understand why my router decided to just like die in the middle of the live stream. But yeah, now we are back. I think what I'm gonna do really is I will keep the original live stream and as a separate video where I'm just gonna upload the prescriptive questions, and hopefully we can bring things back from here. Um, yeah, again, I'd like to apologize for a technical issue, which I had no idea how that happened like that. But now we're back, and I'm just gonna go back through some of the questions that you guys left because I made sure to copy the live chat replay so that I wouldn't lose my place. So yeah, let's see. Do you see the next question? Do you realistically see the level of wealth inequality correcting within the next 30 years? Well, it already started correcting. I think pre-COVID, but and the problem is that like hoping the fast correction usually means something bad happens economically. There's a book by Walter Shield named "The Great Leveler." It talks about what are the types of things that cause inequality to go down over long periods of time or short periods of time, and it's usually war, um, poverty, but in terms of like famine or revolution. Oh, the audio's now messed up too. Oh, great. I I don't understand why. I might have to delay this then. Okay, or good. Yeah, I was just kind of concerned about yeah some of the technical issues here, but yeah. But the point is the Great Leveler. When it comes to that book, what happens is you've got explains that basically it's either famine, revolution, or war that or a great economic depression, like the stock market and the real estate market is collapsing, is causes it to crash. And yeah, because the poor, they're already poor, so they can't really get any worse. But the way the inequality goes down is not because the fortunes of the poor get better, but it's because the fortunes of the rich just get a lot worse. So I don't, and I did a whole video about inequality not necessarily being a problem. I recommend watching that for more context about this. Um, so that is kind of the answer to that question. How would you go about discussing inheritance? Uh, that's a tough question. I mean, this is something you first need to talk about with your parents before you talk about it with your spouse. Because if you don't have an idea of what your inheritance is, it's hard to bring that up. But generally, inheritances are protected. If from divorce, they're usually exempt from going into like a marital estate in most jurisdictions. So it's that is one, but I'm not a state attorney, so don't really quote me on that. Um, so yeah, you definitely got to have a trust set up. Like I just helped one of my family members get her trust all set up. We're in touch with a state attorney friend of mine, and kind of got that handled. And so that's step one. And step two is that you have to basically tell them like you cannot plan your budget around your inheritance. That's a mistake what I think a lot of millennials are making, or whether they knowingly or not knowing it, is like, look, I'll get an inheritance by a certain age, and that will help make up for my lack of savings or my lack of income at this point in my life. And first of all, there's a longevity factor. If you are somebody who's going to expect a sizable inheritance, it means that your parents are likely going to live longer. And because of that, you have what because of the fact that your parents are likely to live longer, it means you're not going to get your inheritance as fast as you would expect. And honestly, I would rather have my parents live longer than get an inheritance earlier, because like the connection and the fight and the familial bonds and just having the experience of having your parents in your life and be good grandparents and hopefully great grandparents is worth more than any amount of money, in my opinion. But that might be just going into the morals of it. But on top of that, though, if you have longer living parents, they're more likely to have a medical condition eventually that's going to require a very expensive level of treatment, or they're going to need retirement care, whether at a retirement home or hiring help to move into their property. And that can burn a lot of cash too. And then there's also a greater risk the longer your parents live that they outlive their investments anyway. So you're not going to get as much as you think. So don't budget around inheritance. But if you are expecting one, it's something you probably should disclose before you get married. But it is a tough subject to bring up. The other thing, too, is you need to iron things out with your siblings. If you have a bad relationship with your brothers or sisters, that is probably the worst thing you can have when it comes to issues of an inheritance. So if that is the case, you're going to have to prepare for finding the right estate attorney to represent you, because it's going to go to litigation if you don't iron out your familial issues with your siblings before, or talk to your parents and make sure that they write an ironclad will and trust that cannot be broken from legal finagling. Again, I'm not an estate attorney, so if you need help with these big things, please hire an estate attorney. And as of the your general disclosures, this is not investment advice on anything. Please do your research. And for the dating type stuff, look, I'm a guy who's never been married in his 30s, so take what I say, anything with that, with a heavy, heavy grain of salt. I generally think that dating advice should be restricted to really people who are in happy marriages, are the ones who know more about that kind of thing. The next question I have here, and let's see, I'm going to go with the ones that let's see if I have any pre-questions. I did save the okay. How do you respectfully bring up a prenup to your partner? Well, you have to just mention, like, look, I suppose you have a business or some real reason to have one. You just, once you tell them what you have and disclose your financials, you just say, hey, look, especially if you grew up with a family member who's been divorced, it's a lot easier to explain like the reasons you'd be concerned. If both of you are from happily married families and have no issue with that, actually, ironically, less trauma makes this harder, because they'll be like, why are you concerned? Whereas if you are from a family who has issues of marital failure, then it's more justified. But I just say you just have to bring it up as part of their financial assets and say, hey, look, I don't want to be in a marriage where one person is incentivized financially to break it. I want to be a team with you, and I want to make sure that there's no skin in the game. But you have to also be fair. You can't propose a prenup that will leave the other person destitute, and you can't really split post-marital assets unequally either, because that's just not really fair, or that's going to cause a discord in your relationship, and rightfully so, because they will think that, look, you're trying to plan the escape hatch before you're already married. So it's a very difficult and careful conversation. And yeah, that's kind of my take on that. And I'm coming from the perspective of a financial advisor, not necessarily from the perspective of somebody who's had to go through this. Will Prop 13 get repealed? Which politicians are willing to fall on the sword for that? Won't that drastically devalue home prices? I mean, I think a lot of the progressive left would be willing to do that, because they'll say it's a bunch of old rich people and inherited wealth who own all the property. So that's already been gotten rid of, in the sense that you can't inherit the cost basis for anybody who died after 2019. And I just think that we'll just chip around at the edges over the years, especially as California's fiscal crisis gets worse. I think the catalyst really for Prop 13 going away isn't some sort of electoral movement. It's more the fact when you see 2 down years in a row in the NASDAQ 100 and you no longer have the capital gains taxes revenue coming in from tech stocks. And that revenue is going to have to be made up from somewhere. And I think Prop 13 is where I think it's going to ultimately have to come from. So, and I think with that, that is all the pre-internet failure questions. And by the way, everybody, thank you for sticking around despite all the technical difficulties we've had. I'm going to have this live go a little bit longer for you guys to make up for it because, yeah, I don't really want you missing out. But the next question I've got here is, and I don't understand, what's it called? Can you get an opinion on how to properly apply to HHI index and calculate fragmented markets? I watched my video HHI in 3 minutes, and I think the formula is on there. It's basically just a measure of concentration. If it's below a certain, like 1,000, it's a competitive market. If it's above like 2,800, it's a very uncompetitive market. But it's not really the be all end all of how competitive an industry is, because you may have a bunch of companies in a similar industry, but they all do different things. So it might be a mini monopolies instead of really just a truly competitive market. Won't Prop 13 just increase private equity buying power? No, I mean, private equity still has to, private equity, it actually would decrease private equity buying power, because the only reason why it makes sense for private equity to buy real estate is if the yield on rent is higher than the bond market net of anything else, of everything else. Like if you take out property taxes, take out repairs and eviction costs or any of the other expenses involved with owning real estate, you need to, it needs to be higher enough yield than a bond market. And there's only one time where this really made sense, and that was in the ZERP era, when you had, and after Operation Twist and a bunch of other measurements from the Fed, which caused people to be super bullish on bonds. So that is the question that I would have is, I think that right now the Treasury bond market, like the average yield to maturity is like over 4%, and that also excludes state and local income taxes too. So if you're in like a place like California with high state and local income tax, you even need a higher yield to justify buying that property. So, like say for example, the net on a city like San Diego, the net of all your expenses, you get a cap of like 2. Why would you buy the apartment building or the house in San Diego when your bond yield is over double what your effective rent yield is? That's why, like, I'm not really afraid of people like BlackRock and private equity buying all of the real estate, because you can get much higher yields in the bond market without doing any work. Like being an institutional landlord is a business. It's a job. You have expenses. It's a lot of work and effort and energy going into it. And unlike what's it called on the individual level, institutions can't really lever as much and as low rates as people who buy less than like 4 units. So like it doesn't really increase the buying power. It would make property more affordable for smaller buyers, whether it's individual homeowners or small time real estate investors who are buying units, built properties of 4 units or less. Yeah, I mean, will the overall expense of housing like go down? Maybe not, because the gains and taxes might be equally offset by price declines. But I don't think that institutional investors win. In fact, they're probably one of the bigger losers from the removal of Prop 13. Let's see. Would a relationship ever bring you to another city? If so, where would you live? I don't think people should move like generally solely for romantic purposes. You have to figure out, it has to be your overall quality of life thing. Like, and I'm not gonna really get into my personal life too much when it comes to this, but yeah, if I'd picked a move out of or Southern California, it would be for other reasons. Maybe just because I think either no matter even how successful my business goes, if property prices remain going super high and they just don't come down in the economic gravity, then I just might not be worth it to raise a family from a financial perspective. Then I might, or if I say like my family all moves away, maybe I would. But I really don't see myself leaving where I live just because I have a lot of social, family, business ties, and I like the weather and the quality of life where I live. So I don't like if you move someplace solely just for dating opportunities and you don't find that special someone and you don't like anything else about the city, that's just a recipe for disaster and misery, in my opinion. I mean, you could always visit a place for extended periods of time, and you could always, and if you don't think that you will find the right romantic partner, because there are certain cities, like if you're a conservative person in San Francisco, or if you're a progressive person living in a more conservative part of the US or just a more socially restricted country in the world, you might need to go to other places. But if you find some place, you should have a plan that like by a certain time period to decide whether you want to live in your city or their city and map it out so you can hopefully lead to a longer term relationship. But that's my thoughts on that. Yeah. Um, I'm not really the one to ask about how professional females' love life is since I'm not one of them. But that's an interesting comment. Let's see. Let's go scroll through some of the comment questions that I've got here. All right. Looks like that's why it's only top chat. I gotta open up the everything. Now I will see it. Should parents encourage traditional career paths like finance or law, or let children choose their own? Yeah, if I missed your comment on the last video and it's a relevant question, just please repost it here. I think I got most of them, and I already answered them earlier on this live. But yeah, when it comes to choosing that your kids, I mean, it depends on your financial situation and their financial situation. I would recommend, in general, you should, if your kids are going to 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 school or university, that you should maybe put restrictions on majors if they don't have a defined plan with what they're going to do with it. Like if it's a major financial hardship for you to pay for your kids' college, you have a right to have an impact on what they study if you're paying the bills. And they could be able, I think people should choose whatever career they want, but they should study something worthwhile in case if like the dream path doesn't work out. And so they have some skill set to fall back on. That's kind of my view on it. Like you can't really force people to be a profession they don't want to be. They're going to either resent you or they won't be that good at it because they just don't have the motivation, or they'll fail out. Like my family tried to push me to be an attorney, but I had no desire to be an attorney. So I didn't bother to take the LSAT or study for law school. And I just told them, and I ran the numbers on it and I explained to them like, look, real pay for lawyers has declined by a significant amount since the late 80s. I don't really have much of a passion or an interest of being a lawyer. So stop trying to push it on me for your own reasons. I'm going to pursue my career in finance. There are practical things I can do with it. And they dropped it. So that's kind of like an example right there. I think you should be considerate that, like, hey, look, this path might be a dead end. If you're like, I wouldn't recommend sending somebody to college just to get a major that doesn't have any application. It also depends where you go to school. Like if you go to like an Ivy League school, who cares what your major is? It doesn't really matter. But for less prestigious schools, you have to be more cognizant about that because of the way employers view that degree. Yeah. What's it called? The next one is, how do professional men, doctors, bankers, etc., manage their partners a lot of money in very little time? It really depends because there's different men with different goals. Like some men don't really want a serious relationship and they will use their busyness as an excuse to avoid it. There are others who do want a serious relationship and they will use the extra resources and the busyness to filter people out. Like you also, the main difference I would say of somebody like that is, I think in the professional classes, and I'm going to talk about this in the video released on Sunday, they're not as trusting as like typical middle class professionals are. They're not high class enough that they're going to marry people for strategic reasons, like in terms of like your family can help me with this and my family can help you with that. That's more like the very upper classes do that kind of thing. But they're going to be, I think that the professional classes that you're mentioning, I think, and I think this applies to women too, are going to be more aware of intentions, and they're going to be like, why do you want to be with me? Especially as a man, it's like, do you want to date me just because you want a certain lifestyle, or would you have been attracted to me even if I had no money? Especially if it's like a nerdier guy who did not maybe get very many women when he was younger, and then starts to make money and they start to come in a little, and he gets a little bit more success dating. He's going to constantly be questioning, does this person like me for me? And that kind of belief is what is going to win, I think, his heart over. Will be like, is that if he can prove, or she can prove, or he can prove, or one way or the other, that they're together for the right reasons, and she's not trying to get a lifestyle from it. Because, and also I think those people are going to be more adamant on prenups. That's the other, I think, difference too, because they have a lot more to lose in a relationship. Like I said in my video, and I think it's going to elaborate in a future one, I think the middle class have the easiest time for true love relationships because they both have an equal amount of skin in the game. Like they both have high paying enough jobs that they're self-sufficient and not dating for those kind of reasons. But at the same time, neither of them have enough to lose that they would be able to trust each other better. It's more, I'd say, pure in that way. The next question. Yeah. A lot of successful men are avoidant. Yeah, that's probably true. And it's probably a lot of the avoidant fears is what drove them to be successful. Because a lot of people who are very successful because they didn't feel like they had enough self-worth growing up, that they're intrinsically, that they needed to have some sort of success to say like, hey, I'm actually matter in society. How to date old money from established class or even new money from the counter elite, from either a middle class or a poor guy like Dan Humphrey from Gossip Girl. I've never seen the show Gossip Girl. I know a lot of my sisters have talked about it and other women in my life as used as an example. But the thing is that if you want, it depends what you want. If you want true love, you're better off dating plus or minus one class from you. If it's two classes or more gap, there's definitely a control element there. So you will have to accept being subservient if you want to date that much up the ladder. And you're going to have to probably, that's kind of the deal. You have to have some sort of social currency that the other one wants and be able to maintain that. And it's not just money necessarily. It's definitely not money. It's the class thing. But that's how it looks like. I mean, the best way to do that is go to university. If you want a more genuine relationship, it's probably just to go to university with those people if you're both around college age. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that. And yeah, most rom-coms do appear to be middle class. I think they're more upper middle class, a lot of them, but that is a good point. What is your opinion on the recent roll-ups and acquisitions going on the commercial and residential services industry? Well, it makes sense because a lot of boomers are retiring and their kids may not want to inherit it, or they may not have kids to inherit it. And so you might as well get something for your business instead of nothing when you're in retirement and shutting it down. And so there's a lot more sellers than there are buyers. And so that's what the appeal of these roll-up strategies is, because if you can have a bunch of these in the same town, to say like a dry cleaning business, for example, it's probably some economies of scale running 10 dry cleaning businesses all in one city versus just one dry cleaning business. And so buying them too also has a built-in customer base, so you don't have to open your own second or third locations and market it that way. So that is the other example really is you can have so I think there is something, but you have to look at the numbers on it. I don't think it's as easy as some people are pitching it on the internet or in financial conferences. If it was, it would have happened a long time ago, in my opinion. But that's the example. The next thing is, do you have any general advice for an engineer in the field of electrical power or electronics? Is there any hope to have 8 kids and big enough of a house for them? Is 2 kids the max nowadays, realistically? If I was in the electrical engineering specialty, I would try to tailor my skills the most possible towards robotics. Like, I think there's a lot of opportunities to be had in developing robotics to replace a lot of manual labor and domestic help. Like, I did a whole video last year about Mobile Aloha, like this robot that can like cook eggs and fold laundry and things that Google and Stanford are working on. And I think there's several other companies that are going to build it. Rosie is coming. And if you can be involved in the process of everybody having a Rosie the robot from the Jetsons in their house, there's probably a lot of money to be made. I would learn those skills and then partner up with a good business development person to start a startup in that space. The next question is it hope to have 8 kids and big enough for a house for them? It depends where you live, to be quite honest. You could buy a house that is big enough for them. You could also build one too. But if you're going to have that big of a family, you're going to have to live probably in a more rural or exurban area, because like in a big city, there's just probably simply not going to be a place big enough unless you don't mind having all your kids share rooms. Like, I grew up in a family of 5. I'm the oldest of 5 siblings. So I kind of have some experience with big families, to be quite, and like, you could fit in a 2,500 to 3,000 square foot house with a 5-kid family. And there's plenty of those options if you wanted to. The big expense for that is, again, what city you live in and also sending them all to college. So I think depending on your income and how much like certain conveniences, like, look, if you have 5 kids, you're not gonna be able to travel to Europe as much as you did if you were a single person. Or you're gonna have some other luxuries you're gonna have to cut. But it can be done. I know a lot of people from 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 children families just from the Catholic community locally here in Southern California, and they all managed to make it work somehow. I personally wouldn't have more than 5 children just because there's logistical problems. Like, most cars have a maximum capacity of like 7 to 8 people. So if you want to have 2 parents, 5 kids, and you need space for luggage or friends or a dog, it's just very difficult to transport people. And then hotel rooms and a lot of for vacation and air tickets. I think it gets really complicated. You'll have to have like these certain vans. I've seen them a lot in town that you can fit, like they're like almost like mini versions of party buses in a way that you can fit like 8 people and have 4 rows in them. But it's a more expensive, but if you really want to dedicate for it, you can do it. Yeah, like the Ram transport van. That's what I was trying to mention. But yeah, so that's what's it called? The next question I had. So that hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so next question I have is, what do you think about having independent insurance brokerage? I mean, I've met plenty of people who've done that and have worked for them. So, I mean, it really depends what kind of insurance you're providing and how good of a salesperson you are. It's like running an independent insurance brokerage is essentially like a sales type profession. And if you're good at sales, you can make a lot of money doing it. But yeah, I personally am not involved in the insurance industry, but I've known plenty of people who have been successful doing it. And if you're an entrepreneurial person and have good people skills and are willing to really aggressively network in your community, it can be a very viable business. Let's see. All right. Next thing I'm going to say is, if someone had $1 million net worth but wanted to build generational wealth, what would you recommend? It depends. What is that net worth in your residence, or is that liquid? And also, where do you live, and a variety of other things. But and also what age? Like if you're like 1 million, like let's say you realistically, you can double that money every 10 years if you had the help of a good advisor, or if you had a good, or if you had an upward trajectory in the market. Like there's no guarantee, but like the rule of 72, and you get 7% a year, you're probably going to double it in a little over 7 years on average. But even if you do that, that's probably by the time that fortune does become a $10 million fortune, 10 million probably won't go as far due to inflation. And so as a result, that's not enough. If you really want to make truly generational wealth, which is like the 20 million liquid plus a paid off property, you're going to have to start some kind of business. And you can use some of that $1 million to finance the initial capital to starting that business. And what that business is really depends on someone else. So it depends on personality and a variety of other variables. So that's kind of my opinion on that. All right, next question. Is there a certain financial threshold you want to cross before marriage and having kids? Well, I mean, again, I think the same one I talked about with dating in the last video. You want to have enough money plus $12,000 a year above break even before starting dating, because your income's going to grow as you get older and you work hard in your career. So I wouldn't really, you can't expect the income you have now to be what you have to live off of your entire life. That's a kind of a cynical, depressing kind of view. So, and also if you get too rich, you're going to have to, as I mentioned with the professionals issue, you're going to worry about intentions. And so it's not necessarily like, I don't like the idea of saying like, oh, you got to become a millionaire before you can consider dating, because that just brings out its own set of problems. But yeah, for marriage, it's just that I would say that you either have you meet the right person and you figure out a financial plan together, and you're sustainable enough that like you're not like a few paychecks away from being destitute. And you can have the kids when it makes sense. Like most people feel like they should, like, and again, I'm not an expert on any of this, but when you can afford to buy a house, that's when you should have your second child. That's kind of maybe a rule of thumb. But you can live in an apartment or a small townhome with one kid, maybe even two. But if you want a bigger family, I'd say the number is really when you can afford to buy a house, to have 3+ children. And then, but yeah, I wouldn't really set a hard number on it. Just more of like your career is in the right place, and you have a trajectory of like that's either more predictable or that will have the upside to get to where you want to go. That's kind of my advice on it. Would you rather marry somebody who's stable and great but a bit boring, or marry someone with a lot of passion who gets you super fired up? How do you manage risk in relationships? Um, yeah, but it depends on like, I mean, that's a tough question. I don't really think I think we're really, yeah, I'd have to think about that one. I think that why can't you find somebody who is a stable and great person that is you are passionate about? Like, can't you have it both ways? Like, I just think that's kind of a false choice. Um, what city, um, what hot cities do you think is the best for opportunity? You're talking about like hot weather cities to build a career. That's the answer. It's Miami and Dallas, and then to a lesser degree, I probably after that would be um, Charlotte and Atlanta in the United States. Uh, but I think that's the guess. What is the ideal time and age to get married if you want to have kids? Uh, I don't really think anybody should be really getting married before the age of, say, 24. That'd be like the floor. Like you should be finished with your undergrad degree before you're married and have at least like 1 year in the real world. But after that, it really depends more on meeting the right person. Like, I mean, the thing is, you should probably start looking seriously for that when you graduate from college. But it may take some people 1 year to find them, and it might take others 20 years to find them. And it's hard enough to find somebody who you'd want to be married to. And so if you happen to get lucky and find him or her early, um, then great. But like if you meet the right person and you say, "Oh, I need to wait till I'm 30 to get married, or need to date a certain amount of people before I get married," you might be just blowing your opportunity, to be quite honest. So that is what's it called? My thoughts on that is you meet the right person and you have like your financial foundation. Generally, like if you was like be more specific, like I would say the ideal age for a man to find somebody would be, I don't know, anywhere from 27 to 40. But the thing is you've got I think it's when you meet the right person more than anything. And depending on the way certain people's life paths evolve, they might meet them at different times. Like a lot more professional class people either have to go to graduate school or they live in cities that may not be lined up with their values, or that they have to work super long hours. So they might not get that chance until their 30s. Whereas somebody who lives in a more like low cost of living community and maybe has a job at her family business and has a more stable trajectory, then they can easily get married younger. So like it's all dependent on your economic situation. Speaking of cities, what are your thoughts about living in Silicon Valley? Uh, it seems very expensive. Thoughts on salary that would keep the average person comfortable there? I actually lived in the Bay Area for a while for my career. And you have to, when you move out to a city like that, especially if you're not starting a business, you're going there for extended education, essentially. You go there to learn a certain skill set that, or meet the right connections that will help you advance for the next level of your career. Like, I wouldn't take living there permanently as like the strategy unless you just really love it. Like, there are some people who really love living in the Bay Area. There's some very nice um, suburbs in the Bay Area, such as Los Gatos or Foster City, or in a Marin area like Sausalito or San Rafael, and and like Morinda, Moraga, etc. You can watch my Geography of Wealth if we want to go into details of where I think I would live if I was going to live in the Bay Area. But the point is that the when it comes to the Bay Area, though, you have to treat it again like extended education. You're going to go there. You'll probably you need probably today's money, probably at least $130,000 to $150,000 a year if you're going to move there as a single person. Family, it's going to be higher. Uh, and so that is my thoughts about income you probably need. It also depends what stage of life you're in. Like if you're just out of college and have friends you can be roommates with, maybe that number is like down to 100. If you are um, somebody who's a little older and more experienced, wants to live on their own, it's at least 140. But the plan really isn't to live there your whole life. It's to meet the right connections or learn the right skills to either move on to a job in a city you want to live in long term, or to start a business in your field. Like I lived there, and that's how I treated my experience there. I knew I wasn't going to stay there the rest of my life. I went there as kind of an extended education where instead of me paying for tuition, I got paid to learn and develop my skills and build my network. And it's good for that, especially if you work in technology. So, and it's really, if you're going to work in finance or tech or even big law or some of these other like white shoe type professions, you generally have to spend 3 to 5 years in one of these really crowded, big, often politically left leaning cities, whether it's Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Boston, DC. Like you're going to have to probably put your time in those places. And it's not your whole career, but living 3 to 5 years in one of those spots is not a bad idea for a young person. Um, Hopefully that answers your question. And if you are like, and also depends on the traffic is really bad there too, especially when you're driving between, say, like SFO and San Jose, the area around Palo Alto is some of the worst traffic in America. So you want to live kind of close to your work. I know some people who took the Caltrains all the way up and down the peninsula, but if you're working in San Francisco, you should probably live in the city or very close by, or maybe. And then if you're working in the Silicon Valley area, I would live by Santana Row in San Jose, or maybe if it like, or maybe Los Gatos if you are more of a family or you have more money. But that's kind of my take on that. Is California in decline, and is Texas becoming the California of the past? That's a great question. I think that California is eventually going to recover, but I think it's kind of going through some pains right now, kind of like what happened. I think the West Coast is at risk of becoming the next Rust Belt. And I talked about this in my video, San Francisco is the next Detroit, if you want to see more details. And I think if I had to compare the West Coast cities, like I think San Francisco is like Detroit. I think LA is like Chicago. I think LA and the surrounding areas have the most upside and are most likely to remain in terms of their cultural importance and economic power in the region, kind of like Chicago. And then I think San Diego is probably like Milwaukee, and I would compare like Sacramento to like Indianapolis, and Seattle and Portland to like Ohio cities. Like those are the real risks of kind of like their trajectories, because a lot of those other cities outside Los Angeles have way too high a percentage of their employment in software development and software related jobs. And as software becomes an industry that is more widespread, then you're going to have an AI disrupts a lot of software. You're going to have a lot less software jobs in the West Coast, and therefore the root of their employment is going to deteriorate. Even if the big tech companies stay in the headquartered there, kind of like how the big three stayed headquartered in Detroit, they moved a lot of the jobs out of Detroit to either the South or internationally. And I think you can see the same thing with the software jobs. That's a lot easier because instead of having to build another factory, you just rent new office space or even have them work remote and just say, and fly out your coders to a new city. So that is kind of my take. And I think Texas, Texas and Florida are the new California and the new West Coast. I think Miami, Dallas, Austin, Houston, and Tampa are probably all going to be cities on the rise. Same with Atlanta. Atlanta actually probably has like the highest paying jobs relative to cost of living, which makes it relatively attractive. And I think as a result, the politics in a lot of those places is probably going to become more blue because it attracts a lot of younger people from other parts. Whereas I think the West Coast is probably going to get more politically red for the same reasons. But yeah, I think long-term California will always be an important place and a successful place, but they're going to have some pain as the economy is going to be forced to restructure to become more competitive. Um, Maryland has the highest median household incomes. Do you have any thoughts? Well, Maryland is right next to DC, and you can kind of figure out why they may have high median household incomes because of that. A lot of political connections. The other thing too with Maryland is also very highly educated, is one of the highest college education rates of any states. But the cost of living is fairly high in Maryland. So like adjusted for cost of living, it's not the place with the best bang for your buck. Um, and yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that. And actually, what do you think about London and the UK? I did a video about the economic future of the UK a couple of years ago when Truss had her brief premiership, and I was pretty bearish back then. I mean, I still remain pretty bearish about the UK because outside the financial services industries, their export base or like what they offer to the rest of the world is rather limited. They could use Brexit to become more economically competitive, but they so far have not been able to do that. And this is a structural problem that's gone on for over a decade over there, where they just have very high budget deficits, very high trade deficits, and really in the post-imperial era, they don't they lack enough things to offer to the rest of the world to maintain their standard of living, and that's why it's been kind of a mess. And it's also overcrowded. Um, it's smaller as California, but it's got almost double the population, and that's creating a lot of housing issues and social tensions as well. Um, Maybe Britain could have its like awakening moment and restructure its economy, but that's probably going to be a while. Um, yeah, and then I think gold will hit 3K an ounce or dip before then. I don't really go into specific trading advice, so I'm not going to answer that question. What is your most optimistic economic future in the U.S. and on the contrary, your most pessimistic economic prediction for the U.S.? Watch the interview I did with Chris about the bright economic future of the U.S. to get the optimistic answer. But it's just the idea that you have a lot of tax and economic and tech reform, along with massive technological advancements in AI and robotics, which is rapidly increase the productivity and the salaries for younger people. And as a result, you get just a giant boom. The real bear case is that, let's just say, you don't like all of these proposals that President Trump do just completely fail, and they expand the deficit to the point where you have a real fiscal crisis in the United States, that the ability to pay its debts become at risk. And then as a result, you have major like austerity where you actually have cuts to Social Security and Medicare to the point or government or to the point where the people react and vote a radically left-wing government, and you have FDR 2.0. That would probably be the bearish case for America, and or that like America just isn't able to technologically innovate anymore for some reason. Like our education system gets super bad, and or um, it's just the entrepreneurial vigor dies, and some other part of the world takes the lead in technology, and that's game over, really, for America at that point. But I'm actually think the outcome is probably somewhere in between, but probably closer to the more optimistic outcome, because a lot of the risk of job losses from AI are going to be made up for through shrinking young people populations and like the mass retirements of boomers. So I think, and society will have enough time to adapt to technological displacement of employment. Um, and then opinion on Doge. I don't think I mean, I made a video about spending. So that's kind of my opinion. I think Doge is doing a good thing. I think that you've got, I think that it seems like the first serious attempt to really go after the inefficiencies and excess spending in the government. And I did a video about balancing the budget. It's still there. I don't think I've deleted it. So, um, yeah. What do you think about companies reincorporating Nevada and Texas? What are the drivers? I think the drivers are mainly taxes and regulatory, and those might outweigh the benefits of the court system in Delaware. Um, you generally want to incorporate for your smaller business in the jurisdiction you live in because you're going to have some sort of entity there anyway. It's really when you get to like very big companies where that kind of thing matters. How will the growth of female spending power shift the dating market? I mean, even before feminism, women were the ones who were making most of the spending decisions because even in traditional households, a lot of men deferred their finances to women. So I'm not really as concerned. The only thing is that you can't really compete solely on money. Like the amount of money you need to make to basically be attractive solely as a provider, net of any other personality traits, is a lot higher. That's really the only difference. Yeah, and then opinion on the Donald Trump versus the United States bureaucrat situation. Well, I mean, I think that in general there's some room. We could probably cut 10% of the government bureaucrats without really missing a beat. I think that the main risk is that he's offering this big buyout, and hopefully that encourages and speeds up the process. But the risk is that the most competent people, or the ones that could actually get jobs in the private sector, are the ones who take those bids, and the people who aren't competent are the ones who stay. So there might be a negative selection bias with the buyout. But in general, I think it's a step in the right direction. Let me just scroll up to some of these comments, questions that I have here. Let's see. How do you vet somebody for a future romantic partner? Yeah, I mean, I would say really that's a very long question, but you first need to do is write a list of what you're looking for in advance. Maybe after, if you had and so that is, and think about the traits that you want in terms of like personality and what your life goals are, and just kind of have an idea of that. And then just ask certain questions. This is probably a question that I'm not going to talk about in public, but if you come to one of my fan meetups, I could go more into it in private. And speaking of that, we are expanding the tour, the Analyzing Finance with Nick tour, quite a bit. Our next stop, speaking of the next question, what do you think of Austin, Phoenix, and LA? Is that Austin and Phoenix are 2 of the next 4 stops in the Analyzing Finance with Nick tour. In fact, I'm going to be next weekend in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is why I'm doing this live stream today and not on actual Valentine's Day, because I will be on a plane to Arizona. So if you want to come and meet me at the Arizona meetup, so yeah. And then here's the link. And then after that, we're also going to Miami on March 1st. So all you Floridians, you want to come to Florida, we have that. And then we're going to have another one in Southern California in Newport Beach on April 5th. So I'd love to see all the people there. And then we're also going to the north, to Texas, Dallas on the April 25th, and Austin on April 27th. And then we're having a week on the northeast with New York, May 10th, DC, May 17th, and Philadelphia, May 12th. So if you guys want to come to the tour, to these stops, please register in advance. I also could use your guys' help really in terms of finding venues in some of these cities. Depending on how many people sign up, I'm going to need something that's a little bit bigger than just meeting casually at a restaurant. And if people have suggestions on how to, or where I should host some of these events, any sort of referrals would be greatly appreciated. So that's and then the last one I'm going to announce is we're going to have one in Canada too, in Calgary on June 1st. So the Canadian subscribers want to see me without having to come to the US. I'm going to be in Calgary. So I put all the links there. And if your city is not included, you can vote on the form about what city you would want to see it. And when we do have something planned there, you'll get an email. So, but that's just a good segue. What do I think about Phoenix? I think Phoenix is kind of like Tampa of the West. It's doesn't have the problem. Phoenix is gonna have a lot of people moving there because of the weather, and and it's relatively low cost of living, so it's gonna attract a decent amount of retirees. The problem is that they don't have that many like major companies or core industries headquartered there. So it's not going to bring in like the high IQ, like really upper middle class professional jobs like some other metropolitan areas are. I think it's one of my favorite places to spend the winters. It's great for golf. But it's kind of a place more you want to do is either you've already made your money or you're retired. It's not really a place you go to prove yourself or to make it. Um, and then Dallas, I think, is going to become like the next Los Angeles. Like it is a place where big businesses are moving their headquarters to. It's a place where deals are happening. And it's spread out like Los Angeles and has similar traffic dilemmas, except without a beach. And so, yeah, that's kind of my opinion on Dallas. Can you speak to living in high cost of living USA, remote USA, Switzerland, is a Singapore for high income W-2 owners over the course of their career? Assume average desire to have a family. When it comes to if you're a high income W-2 income earner, I would say that the tax benefits of living in Singapore are there, but if you're over like the expat allowance, like I think it's like 120,000 a year now, you're still going to be paying some federal taxes. And Singapore has a similar cost of living to California, like coastal California, except with lower taxes, just as perspective. But they also have a work culture for W-2 that most Americans probably would not want. Like 996, like you hear about in the news in China, was a thing when I lived in Singapore. And so if I'm a W-2, I wouldn't really recommend living there. Switzerland could be nice if your income is compensated with the right COLA bounce. If you don't get a COLA bounce to adjust for the Swiss cost of living, I wouldn't go. But if you do, I mean, it's the one place in Europe that I think you can actually get ahead. And so, and it's a very high quality of life. I mean, that's one of the places that's probably is the country I would live in outside the US. Answer this other question here would be Switzerland. So other country, and then, but it's really like in high cost living US in terms of living in those cities, it's the best chance for career advancement and to make good networking connections. Low cost of living US is if you've already kind of hit your ceiling or you're close to it, you don't have to worry about the promotion ladder anymore. Low cost living US is probably and you don't have family ties keeping you somewhere or not as picky about climate like me. Low cost of living US is probably your best bet. And then remote, you have the risk that like if there is any layoffs, you're probably the first one to go. So that's the downside really for remote US. And I've mentioned the other ones, but it's really dependent on your stage of your career. If you're younger, earlier stage of your career, I would do high cost of living US. If you are more senior, I would do low cost of living US. Favorite countries, I would live outside the US. I already mentioned Switzerland. I also like if I already had made my money and just want to relax, I'd probably consider the Cayman Islands and Uruguay. You get favorable tax treatment. They're very nice beaches and pretty good weather. There are certain bad seasons you want to get out of the Cayman during hurricane season, but find some place to go during the summer. But and also those places can get a little sleepy. But if I'm not really looking to, if I'm a more retiree and want a slower pace of life, those places aren't bad. And then the other thing you have to factor is if you have kids about education quality. Like a lot of these countries that people want to move to for low cost of living may not have the best education quality. It's also the same reason why I'm hesitant to live in Hawaii if I had a family. So you really want to figure out like, if you want your kids to go to elite universities, you need to live in a place that will help set up for that. And that usually means staying in the high cost of living parts of the US. Do you think the 2010s are underrated as a great time in America? Homes were very affordable. especially in the early 10s. Cost of living is favorable. Crime was at all-time lows. I have mixed views because homes were really only affordable in the low cost of living metros. The high cost of living metros, they got very unaffordable as early as 2013. And you had people complaining about rent being more than 50% of their income all across the West Coast as early as 2013. So it's not entirely true. And also wage growth was really bad back then. So you didn't really have people didn't really have that much disposable income, even if the cost of living was lower. I really think America has kind of been in an economic dark age really since 2000. And hopefully we now start to come out of it. But the 2000s were rough. 2010s were fairly rough. And the first few years of the 2020s were pretty bad too. But I think the 2010s were probably the second best period in the last 25 years, other than like 01 to 06 was probably the best period in the last 25 years. But it was kind of a bad time. Thoughts on homeschooling? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Whenever I have a family, I would want to do something like a pod, maybe, where I would team up with other local families and we would try to find like teachers that we can hire and rent out like an office building or something and just create our own independent school. Because I think there's a socialization problem if you just have homeschooling with just your own immediate family. So you want to incorporate other people, but at the same time, the problems of the school system and the psychological damage it does, particularly to neurodivergent and academically gifted kids, is worse than the socialization disadvantages of homeschooling in many cases. So you want to kind of have the best of both worlds. You want to have friends and like peer groups, but you don't want to have the toxic people that are inevitable with a school of any size, if it's in a rich neighborhood, or the teachers may teaching things that may not be aligned with that individual or family's values. So I would be advocating of something in between where you team up or find a private school that has aligned with your certain values. There's a lot of these startup type private schools popping up here in Southern California, and I assume they are in other places where they do cater to different demographics of parents with different values, that you can kind of have a school that's more established, but without the negative effects of that. So that's my thing. Is public school actually wage slave training? Yeah, I mean, in many ways it is. It's also daycare in a lot of ways for working parents who just can't have their kids at home all the time alone. So there's a lot of other social goals that are derived from the public school system than just simply educating people. But I'm not against public education, because you need to have a minimum level of education to have a functioning society. Like if I in the small government versus the big government debate, kind of the line I have, like the government getting more involved than public education is probably where I support cuts. But then beyond that, I generally tend to be favor of government doing things like that. Then you've got the next question. While Mississippi and West Virginia are the poorest states, they rank number 2 in homes owned outright. I think a bias of the age of the people who live there. I think a lot of younger people don't really want to live in those places because there's not really that many career opportunities. So the people who live there are likely older people who have already paid off their mortgages. And Maryland is last because I don't think there's there's probably a lot of transplants who move to the greater DC area, and it's a high cost of living city. So the most of the people who've moved there have been within the last 30 years or so and probably still have mortgages to pay. Did you see the whole USA spending fiasco? Yes, I did. And I haven't really commented on it yet because it's still kind of playing out. And I don't know if it's really more of an analyzing politics with Nick versus an analyzing finance with Nick. It seems like the Doge is going to be eliminating it based on what I've read about it. What are your thoughts on the biggest recent mistake that has affected the American economy post FDR? Well, there's a lot of them. Well, one, I think it's the guns and butter policy of Lyndon Johnson is probably number one, where you both greatly expand the welfare state with things like Medicare and a lot of the welfare programs of the 60s, while at the same time waging Vietnam. And that extreme level of unsustainable deficit spending is what led to us ultimately having to leave the gold standard in the early 70s. That's number one. Number two, I would say TARP and bailing out the banks, not because it was a failure of a policy, but the second order effect of creating entitlement bailout culture has been a major drag to society since 08. And then you've got the other one would be when Biden first passed this first stimulus bill, which extended the amount of time you could spend on unemployment during the pandemic. So it restricted labor supply and the amount of people willing to make goods and services in the economy when demand was rising. And so it created the inflation. There were other things that caused the inflation of this early decade, but that was a big one. And I knew from that point forward that this was going to be Carter 2.0. Next question. Where is the best city for dating? Need to move soon. Looking for new career opportunities. I would move based on where your best career opportunities are or other personal reasons why you like a city. But if you really want to move just for dating, probably the best city in America for single men is probably New York City. There are other reasons why you wouldn't want to live in New York City, but just if the ratio of college educated men versus college educated women is in favor of men. And a lot of reasons a lot of young men don't want to live there because they think it's not worth the money to live there. And women are rather factor into other quality of life things like access to culture and museums and walking convenience and and they don't care as much about just the bottom line. And that's why a lot of the northeastern cities tend to have more young women than young men. And Chicago is a similar dynamic. Whereas the cities that tend to attract more younger, successful men are ones with good weather, lower cost of living, and high paying jobs. So that is often California, Florida, Dallas, Seattle, just the western half of the U.S. generally. And so that's why, that's kind of the so if you're really trying to pick metro areas based on dating opportunities, the best ones for men are Northeast, Chicago. The ones that are the best for young women are the Pacific Northwest and the Bay Area. And then what's it called? The next question is, what are your thoughts on having a federal mandate for community college to be free? I feel like it'd be a huge plus to the country as a whole. I don't really like the idea of absolutely free college because it creates the Van Wilder effect. I don't know if you guys are too young to have seen the movie National Lampoon's Van Wilder, but it's the idea of this guy. And I met a real life version of one of these guys when I was in college, but this guy's like 25 who just stayed in university for 5, 6, 7 years because he didn't know what to do with his life and was just having too much fun in college. And this happens sometimes in Scandinavian countries too. If you don't have like some sort of economic reason to finish on time, it creates some malincentives. And so I want there to be some sort of cost so that people are incentivized to finish university on time and not just waste their youth in school permanently. And there needs to be a market signal to figure out which degrees are worth taking versus which ones aren't. Do I think college is too expensive? Generally, yes. I think you should have community college be very reasonably priced, but it has to have a price. It can't be absolutely free. And because there's also the JUCO trap where people just keep switching majors and just stay in junior college for way longer than they should. Let's see. The next question I have is China on a gold standard? No, they are not. If they really wanted to make the RMB replace the dollar, they probably would need to get on one. Let's see. All right. You should put a chat on the video. A lot of people are getting shadow banned. How do you know that people are getting shadow banned? I have really no idea. Have you read The Origin of Wealth by Beinhocker? I really like it, but I've never seen it mentioned. I've never heard of that book. If you want books recommended for finance, I recommend joining my Substack because I have on there a guide with that as a reading list of like the top 100 books related to business and finance. And if you join the Substack, the free version, you get it emailed to you. So that's where all my book recommendations are. I have over 100 in there. Good books on game theory. That is a good one. I don't really know any that great books on game theory. I learned game theory mainly through college. I mean, I know a lot of people on the political right, and younger people like to bash the value of college, but if it wasn't for my university experience, I would have never learned. I took multiple classes related to game theory in my undergrad, and that's where I learned it. And most of what I learned about game theory since is reading it about it just by looking up certain terms in game theory or just looking at the world and seeing where the incentives are built in. So I don't know how many books, but there probably are some good books about game theory. I just don't know what they are. So I never thought about going into politics. It's something I've debated. At my current stage of life, I'm not ready to do it. I want to have a certain other benchmarks. I want my business to get us to a certain level first, that I'm not really financially dependent on a few donors. I also want to have a family and children who are old enough that they can handle the media pressure involved with being in politics. And also my political ideology is not really lined up well with the current political spectrum. And I probably could not win in my jurisdiction. Maybe on a local level, I probably could, but beyond that, it would be very difficult. So it's not something, and also the minimum cost to run a campaign has gone up, that even with my most optimistic projections for my net worth, I'd have to spend well over 50% of it to self-finance a campaign. So it's something I have to think about. How many books would you say read on average a year? A lot less than I used to. And do you count Audible or not? I mean, if you count Audible, I probably read about, 12 to 15 books a year. When I was in my 20s, I read 50 to 75 books a year. But now I'm kind of more in the applying stage of my life. Like, I used to read a lot more. And now, when I was in my more learning phase, but now all the stuff I've learned, I kind of want to actually start applying it. And so I'm learning through doing now more than just reading. But I still read a lot. I read a lot of research reports. I read a lot of random articles or academic journals or other things. And that's how I learn, because I do research for a living. So of course I'm still reading, but in terms of like full length books, I'm reading less of them than I used to. How many hours a day is that? It's not as much. I'm a pretty fast reader, so I can knock out, I could probably read at least 50 pages in an hour. So like that really helps. But yeah, I mean, I would say also in my 20s, I had a lot more free time because I was self-employed. And also I was not really into nightlife. I still am not really into nightlife. And so I use a lot of my Friday and Saturday nights to read. All right. Do you think the demand of ETFs from 401ks is a bubble of any kind? I don't think it's a bubble, but it is the driver of S&P 500 flows, is a big driver of valuations. And if that does reverse, I talked about this in the Great Wealth Transfer video, there will be major economic implications to that. So, I mean, it is so there. I don't know if it's really called a bubble, but the flows are supportive of existing valuations. Let's see. And yeah, I would. All right. What is a good way to become a macro analyst with a bachelor's degree and a few years of irrelevant work experience? I think taking CFA level 1 or something similar like that to prove that you have some base competence. I would also put together some case studies. So when you do apply to these type of jobs, you can show you will know what you do. It also depends. What did you study in undergrad? If you studied finance or business or economics or math, it'll be easier to switch. If you studied something completely irrelevant, it might be harder. And in certain situations like that, it might be worth getting a top 10 MBA. But yeah, it's a lot more on your specific position. Right thoughts. I mean, I think Asia sentiment peaked in 2010s, and so that and Asia does have a lot of potential. At the same time, it's also the region at the biggest risk of an AI ladder pull, where a lot of these people who are getting educated for the first time and getting new jobs on lower ends of the value chain, if they just get completely cut out by robotics and AI, it could lead to a lot of social instability in Asia. Like, I think Northeast Asia will be fine and survive in some shape or form and remain like an important part of the global economy. I think Southeast Asia and South Asia are more at risk of being technologically obviated. But I'm going to do a video about the economic future of India probably coming up in the next few months. And you can watch some of my other economic futures videos for the Southeast Asian countries and Japan and China for more thoughts on that. Yeah. And then I want to ask you, I know people who work endlessly without any goal, but only for the purpose of work. Do you think that work is a means to an end? What do you think about workaholics? Well, this goes back to Max Weber and the Protestant work ethic. I mean, I'm biased since I'm a Roman Catholic, but I don't really buy into the Protestant work ethic. I don't think, and I'm a very Gen Z on this view, even though I am a millennial myself, where is the idea that I don't think work for its own sake is of any value. I think idleness is the devil's workshop, and you don't really want to be sitting around and doing nothing. But work without a purpose is pointless. Like, the idea of toiling just for the sake of toiling does not really appeal to me whatsoever. Like, I generally think you shouldn't work more than 50 hours a week if you are a W-2. Like, it's not worth really the additional effort. If you are self-employed, you should be working probably 70, 80 hours a week, like at the beginning at least, and then scale it down when you've gotten things off the ground. But I understand if you're self-employed, you should be working, or you have some other higher cause. Like, if there's a real reason for what you're doing, work hard. We want people to have real motivations and intrinsic causes and things they want to do. Or if your reward is getting compensated proportionately. Like, if you putting in the extra hours is going to make your business grow a lot faster, it's worth doing. Or if you feel a lot more reward from this, like this channel, even though it's more of like a hobby for me, I get a lot of value emotionally and personally from doing this. And so as a result, it's worthwhile. But to work for its own work's sake, I disagree with this. What social class would a military strategist be? Well, I generally think most of the military is middle class. They have one single employer, which is the government, and they make enough that they can save for a retirement at a normal age, but not really generational wealth. Maybe if you're a private contractor who runs a military strategy business as business owner, you might be in the professional or self-employed class or the successful business owner classes. But I generally think the military is mostly middle class. The future of college in 20 or 30 years. I think that the future of college is it's mixed. I mean, I think that with like modern digital technology, you can have one professor teach lots of more people at scale. So, but I think that college will still be useful for socialization. It'll be still useful for networking. The concentration of so many different ideas and types of classes and activities in one place helps young people figure out what they actually want to do with their life. But I think the business model of college is at risk, and I think college is going to get more affordable. That's the one thing. It already peaked. College costs relative to the CPI basket peaked right before the pandemic. And as the enrollment cliff happens and there's less young people going into the colleges, and you see possible reforms of the Department of Education, which makes government-backed student loans less accessible, I think you're going to see a spike in terms of affordability going down, and I mean going up. Sorry, but prices going down, and you'll also see it easier to get into schools outside of the Ivy League and the UC system because there will be more slots open for the same amount of students. So yeah, I think some of the more marginal, smaller schools are probably at risk of going under. But yeah, I think that college will become more affordable. I think, all right, another call. I think high school should just extend to 15 to 20. I think that's a bad idea. I think high school is psychologically damaging to a lot of people. And if anything, we should try to finish high school quicker and just have a gap year before going to college. Let's see. Other comments that I'm going to bring up before I go to other questions. The other debunking the doomer that I'm going to release for members only is debunking the doomer on hypergamy. And I want, if it's too edgy, let me know. Do you guys want to see that? But it's probably a members only video. The other thing I wanted to mention too is that we are also, forgot for one other tour stop. We're going to actually have four stops in Europe in late August and early September so for European people who are viewing this, we will be having 4 cities, one in Switzerland, one in Italy, and 2 others that are to be determined based on your guys' votes and my travel schedule. The one we have confirmed is September 5th in Rome as part of Catholic Jubilee. So if the Italian viewers can help me find a venue or want to meet up, feel free to register. I look forward to seeing you guys or people traveling to Rome for Jubilee if you're not Italian. The other thing was also I have set up a official Instagram for the channel if you guys want to connect with me that way. And we also have an official Discord for the channel if you want to keep these conversations going amongst yourselves when I am not available, because I can't talk to you guys live 24 hours a day. But we now have a Discord as well if you guys want to join and chat in there. I'm going to post the link in here. And now, after those updates, let's check back to questions. Do you think that the U.S. and that the habitual dangling of chasing to some degree of unrealistic status is unhealthy versus the European model of having a more balanced lifestyle? I can look at it both ways. Like the ambition is what creates the economic growth and the opportunity in America. And if it wasn't for that, and we were more like Europe, you would just have just a stagnant economy, and there would be no place for people to go if they want to advance. America is fortunately a country that allows for social mobility. Most of the world does not. And you can watch my class structures of each region of the world if you want to see that. And so I would say, yeah, I think it's actually you just have to be emotionally mature and psychologically aware enough of these pressures so that you don't ruin your life because of it. That's more of an individual decision. Yeah. And then do you think there's a difference between hypergamy and gold digging? Yeah, because social status is not, and social currency is not just money and power and status. It can be looks based. It can be having a certain personality type that is considered more attractive. It can be having certain life experiences that make you more interesting. So it's not purely a monetary thing. And thankfully, it's not purely a monetary thing, because otherwise it would probably be a lot crueler and colder of a world. Also, how would you summarize the economics of dating in 2025 from a man's perspective? I mean, there's a lot in that question. Yeah, I mean, it depends where you live and a variety of other things, but men just have to factor in finances somewhat, because like if you want, even if you're somebody with a lot of options, say for example, you don't have the time necessarily and the money to date all of them. So you have to be very deliberate so that you can sustainably meet enough people that you can find somebody who fits, but not go broke in the process or get jaded in the process, because emotional capital is just like financial capital. And I think a lot of problems with dating in modern world is that people get too jaded because they've had too many bad experiences or not enough good experiences to make up for it. And then there's the adverse selection problem with the people who are more likely to be good relationship partners happen to be in good relationships. I did a video about this several years ago called adverse selection, which I'll reposting on Valentine's Day in the post section. But I think that's really the most common theme for dating in 2025 for a man, is how to deal with adverse selection, because that's a real issue. Like, is screening for quality. Yeah. In what time frame do you think China becomes the world's largest economy? Could it happen before 2030? It depends. Well, the problem is we'll never know because we don't know how accurate the economic numbers are in China. Like, yeah, if they're growing really at 5 to 10%, like they've claimed to the last 40 years, it could happen easily by 2030. If they're not, then they can't. And then the other dilemma really too is, on top of that, is how do you measure their PPP? Like, are you talking about nominal or purchase power parity? Because a lot of countries will use a unrealistic low cost of living assumption to make the purchase power multiple look greater, to make their economy seem to look better. So the answer really is we won't even know if it happens when it happens. And speaking of, people have mentioned that the Discord link is not working, so I'm going to try to create at least a temporary one for this stream to invite all you guys in. Just give me a second while I do that. All right, so I copy. Here's another one that work at least for within 7 days of this, if you guys want to hop on. Let's see. With women holding 62% of the degrees, how do you consider college-educated women dating a professional? That's really up to them. Like there's a certain bias. We want people who are more educated, but like there are plenty of people who don't have a college education who make more money than those who are college educated, and they might be able to make for it in other ways. Is there a new establishment elite in America? The answer is possibly. Like what Musk is doing, and Trump with their recent ascension, is that they might be dislodging the existing establishment elite, at least in the political class, and replacing it with a new one, probably on the back of tech entrepreneurs and tech CEOs. And so we'll be in the process of a realignment of the elites. And I might make a video about this, but it's kind of too early for me to say whether it's already happened, but it looks like we might be in the process of these. And these elite shakeups generally happen once every 50 years or so. Like the last one we really had was like in the 60s and 70s. So, yeah, that's my answer to that question. Let's see. And then what else do we have here? I'm going to scroll back because I missed a bunch of questions. And if I miss yours, then I might run out of time. Let's see, because there's a lot of them that are asked when I was answering these. All right, the EU dropped tariffs on American cars from 10 to 2%. What's 2.5? What are your thoughts on this? Well, my thoughts on this are this is Europe trying to prevent Trump from getting them involved in a trade war, so they're conceding early. Do I think that on the margin, America will sell more cars to Europe because of this? Yeah. Do I think that American cars are going to become super popular in Europe because of just a tariff cut? Probably not, because most of America's car fleet is like very large SUVs and pickup trucks, which if you've ever been to a European city, they may have no room to park those things. And a lot of the garages and the infrastructure is designed for smaller cars. So I don't really, maybe that's the trendy thing is that Euro culture is going to embrace pickup life, but I don't really see that happening. But yeah, I think it will mean more auto exports from the US to Europe, and Trump will less likely to go after them because he sees that they're making a deal. And Europe relies more on them selling European cars in America than the other way around, particularly Volkswagen, Mercedes, and BMW. What about the British class system, how it relates to the American class system and the European one? Well, I think it's a hybrid, but I think the British class system is closer to the European ones than the Americans. The difference because the British one is the same people since the first English Revolution, really, and even earlier. Some of the people own land in London date back to William the Conqueror. It has a little bit of more social mobility historically on paper, and especially because they were able to export a lot of the discontent people who wanted to move up classes to their colonies. But they still fundamentally have a class system that is more determined based on birth and connections than on merit. Their only really industry they have that can really move up on merit is the financial industry. And on top of that, they do use a relatively generous social welfare system and to placate the lower classes enough not to rebel. So it's a similar model. I think it's closer to the European system, to be honest. But let's see. Next question that I have on here. What are your thoughts on Unscripted by MJ DeMarco? It's a good book. I've read it several years ago. I also read The Millionaire Fastlane about 7 years ago when I first started my own business. And I generally agree with a lot of MJ DeMarco's philosophies on this. I do think that he is a little bit off on political things. I think that political changes actually do have material effects. He was right when he wrote those books in the 90s and the 2000s, that he was right that like both parties are fairly moderate. It didn't really matter, and you shouldn't. But like with more radical policy proposals actually being enacted, it does make some sense to pay attention to those. But really, apart from that, I it's one of my favorite books about entrepreneurship, especially from a mindset perspective. Unscripted. I've read it multiple times. I've recommended it to other people. So, yeah, I think that's a good book. Is this the age of techno-feudalism? I have read Yanis Varoufakis's book and listened to his interviews on this. I think Yanis Varoufakis actually is a very interesting economist. If I wanted an economist who I respect intellectually but has a lot of different views on me to come on the channel, I think Yanis Varoufakis would be one of my first choices. So if any of you guys know Yanis or can make an intro, I'd love to have him on Analyzing Finance with Nick. His idea, for those who are not familiar with it, is that we live with the original feudalism was where you had a concentrated ownership of land, particularly farmland, and the main beneficiaries of economic output were the landowners because most of the costs were the rents that went back to the landowners. The second one is capitalism, where instead of owning land, the main thing to own was capital, which is usually factories or other physical means of production, but it could also be capital equipment. It could be intellectual property, software, etc. And so those who own the capital got the disproportionate gains and output of the economy. And then the third thing that is now what Varoufakis would argue is the what's it called? The techno-feudalist world, where instead of capital being where the wealth is, capital has become increasingly commoditized due to global access to credit in the financial markets, and along with just people building factories all over the place, and cheap manufacturing overseas has really reduced that as a bottleneck. So now the main thing is access to a platform. And the internet has made people be allowed to do business with anybody really anywhere. But however, a lot of the internet is concentrated on a few platforms, and those who pay the fees of the platforms are the ones who get the disproportionate benefits of the economy. So say, for example, if you want to watch like independent content on the internet that's video form, you come here to YouTube, and I may be producing this content and I do get paid somewhat, but Google gets them a big chunk of it as their rent for maintaining the platform. Or Amazon, if you want to, you could sell any product, any manufacturer can list their product on Amazon, but Amazon gets a big cut without having to produce anything. They just charge you the rent of being on their platform. And it could be the same with AI platforms, or it can be the same with digital advertising and Meta on social media. And that's what Varoufakis thinks. We live in a world now that if you can own the few people who own these platforms where everybody exchanges business or goes to do a certain thing digitally, they are the new barons. They're like the people who own real capital don't get the same valuations on their stocks as the people who own these platforms, because they're theoretically infinite scalability without having to put any physical capital into it. So they can have much higher profit margins. And yeah, and it's more efficient for it to do it this way, because if everybody's on one platform, it's easier to have a more efficient market and find everybody versus having to go to a bunch of different platforms for a bunch of different things, which makes the market more disintermediary. The risk is that too much power is going into the concentration of these few big technology companies and holders. And you see like the S&P, like over 35% of it is in the Magnificent Seven tech companies. And so that's what Varoufakis is explaining. Are we in a techno-feudalist society? I don't like giving this answer all the time, but it seems like that's been the answer, is maybe. I think inevitably there will be some other disruptive technology that commoditizes or disrupts these, or if it gets bad enough, the antitrust authorities will get in and force a breakup or require lower fees for the communities. Or there's the idea that's more on the radical left side of things, is that you turn these platforms into utilities where the producers pay like a relatively fixed amount that is the cost of maintaining the natural monopoly with like a fixed profit margin. And therefore the gains of the economy go back to the people who are actually creating the transactions, or the content creators, or whoever. That would, like, the example of a natural monopoly in the real world is like an electric company. Like, it doesn't make economic sense to have competing companies build what's it called? To build a power plant in multiple power plants in every city. Like if there was like 20 different utilities for you to give you electricity, then nobody would build a power plant, because the fixed costs of building a power plant and the grid and all the connections are so expensive that you wouldn't have any viable like electric system. People wouldn't bother to build it because there wouldn't be a return on investment because of competition. And so what we do in the society is we have natural monopolies where the government will permit a monopoly for utilities, And in exchange, they have a cap on their profit margins. And so they have caps on how much they can raise their rates. Because if you give somebody a monopoly without those kind of restrictions, you'll have abuse. And so that's how we manage things like water infrastructure and electricity and cable, fiber optic cable for cable TV and internet, or all these natural monopolies. And maybe some advocate of Yanis Varoufakis' techno-feudalism is going to say, hey, wait, you know what? Why aren't these internet companies just the new digital form of natural monopolies? Like, it doesn't make sense to build all these platforms all over the place, and the marketing spend is so high. Uber could be another one example. Why don't we just allow, say, like Uber to be the monopoly for rideshare, but then we have to give them the same kind of regulations as a utility? And this would also, like the free speech argument too, is like these companies had a Musk acquiring X were disproportionately allowing speech really from only one side of the aisle, and were abusing their de facto monopoly powers. And now they've not. And that was the argument, was to turn them into utility, was so that they could not use selective enforcement of comment moderation. But yeah, that's my thoughts. I know that's kind of a long explanation, but that's my thoughts on that. Yeah. And then the other thing is, what's the real reason why Elon wants the bureaucracy weakened? Does he see them as a threat to his increasing classist power? No. I mean, there could be a few things. One, I think he had a legitimate political awakening, and that happened because of something that happened in his personal life, which I'm not going to discuss on this stream. The second thing, I think, on top of that, is he has a very heavily regulated industry he's in, whether it's in Tesla in terms of the automotive industry. And he also is in another industry that's heavily dependent on government contracts, or can benefit from cost cuts, such as SpaceX. So he does have incentives for the way that government contracts are decided that would benefit his companies financially as well. And yeah, and also a lot of people, his political and business enemies, have tried to personally ruin him, and this is probably some sort of revenge campaign to a certain a certain motivation there. But I think it's a number of variables. But yeah, there are economic benefits to him personally from deregulation, but there are also other reasons. Have I ever been told I look similar to Andy Kaufman? No, I don't think I look anything like Andy Kaufman. I've seen pictures of him. I watched that Jim Carrey movie, Man on the Moon, when I was a kid, about him. And no, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of jokes in the 80s and the 90s that he died of some terminal illness, that he faked his death, and like 20 or 30 years later, he would come back and say, oh, it was all a joke. But we haven't really seen any Kaufman back, so it probably wasn't a joke. But yeah, who's Elon's class? Well, Elon's class he's counter elite. He's like classical counter elite, and he's trying to use the political realignment to move into create the new establishment elite. Well, I don't think that, if I'm wrong, I don't think the wealth gap is increasing anymore. I think it peaked before the pandemic. Wages have been going up, and stock market valuations have not gone up faster, really, outside of a few big technology companies. So, I mean, I don't think that it has. Elon's projected to be a trillionaire by 2027. Well, what is Elon's net worth right now? I mean, you're basically assuming that Tesla stock is going to continue to go up even as faster than its actual profitability and revenues and things like that, which, I mean, or SpaceX is going to become much bigger than expected. I mean, there's a good chance that Elon's net worth has already peaked. Like, I don't really know. You can't really just say, oh, it's certain he's going to be a trillionaire. Who knows? Yeah. Can you name a few people from the establishment? Well, it's generally the political class is in the establishment. Old money families, like the heirs of like the Rockefellers or the Johnson and Johnson fortune, or a variety of other ones. You probably know that. Like, watch Old Money Luxuries channel. He goes into all those establishment elite families, and that's why I don't really do break down specific families, because he doesn't. He does a much better job of explaining those. And in fact, I might do some collaborations with him in the future, because he's a fan of this channel. So cool. Stay tuned for that. Do you think Silicon Valley is going to replace Wall Street's interest? Why or why not? I don't think it's going to replace them, but it's going to create a competing set of interests. So, and the bright side for young people looking to get jobs in finance is that the rise of Silicon Valley has made meritocratic access much more available. Like, it was when I was fresh out of school, like Wall Street was super competitive and restricted to just the Ivy League recruitment, because that was the only place to go if you were an ambitious person really willing to move up a class and make real money. And I just happened to like that profession, but and then whereas when Silicon Valley became more bigger and more established money, it created a competing pipeline for ambitious people to move up the ranks. And so now we have more opportunity sets, not less. So I think it's a good thing you have competing interests. And then there's other cities that have that too. Like Houston is like the big oil center. You have Miami for Latin American finance and cross Pan American trade. You have LA for entertainment and Asia Pacific trade. And yeah, you have the Midwest for heavy machinery interest in manufacturing. So yeah, what are your thoughts on the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund in the US? Well, I don't know if you watched my video that came out on Wednesday, but I did one about the sovereign wealth fund and what they are and my thoughts on it. I think it's generally a bad idea. I mean, if you are a country that either has a large amount of trade surplus or has a natural resource that is so abundant that you can export it, and those exports can pay for all of your government financing, and you don't need taxes, like, great. Like, that's what it's been done in places like Singapore and in the Arab world and in Alaska, Norway. But when it comes to the US has a large debt. Why would you not just use that money to pay down the debts? Like, if you think the sovereign wealth fund can get a higher return than the expected interest payments on the debt, the growth of their increases, then like maybe, but I don't really trust the government to be a better allocator of capital than the private sector. The other thing too is, if your government is primarily financed by taxes and you did have a balanced budget, well, instead of putting that money into a sovereign wealth fund, why wouldn't you just give it back to the taxpayers? I think the average individual taxpayer is a much better allocator of their own money than the government is. Like, if you're in if you like the idea of a sovereign wealth fund, you're basically saying, like, I think the government is better at investing than the private sector, which I will short that bet every time. And I think individuals, if they got that money back in their pockets, would be able to improve their lives or invest it at higher rates of return. And I think businesses in the private sector will generate a lot more wealth. That's my problem with, like, if let's say the U.S. discovered a giant gold mine under Kansas City that was bigger than all the gold supply in the world, and we didn't need taxes anymore. Then there maybe is a circumstance. Like, Alaska has a sovereign wealth fund, and they pay their citizens a dividend every year because of from the returns of that fund. That could make sense. Also, maybe like turning the Social Security Trust Fund into a real sovereign wealth fund, like a pension fund. A lot of Canadian pension funds kind of do that thing and invest. But if you look at the track record of a lot of U.S. pension funds, such as CalPERS, it's not that great. Like, again, people would be better off probably saving their own retirement and investing in the private sector. So I'm not a fan of sovereign wealth funds. The next thing is favorite road trip snacks. Yeah, I mean, there's a few. Like I like goldfish crackers, probably, and Cheez-Its are good road trip snacks. Um, if I'm the other thing is if it's like early morning, maybe a blueberry muffin. Like instead of stopping for breakfast, I just eat that on the road. Um, I don't really eat that. I eat that much snacks generally because it's not good for my health. Like I eat my 3 meals a day and I kind of stick to that. Um, I lost a lot of weight when I was younger simply just by giving up snacks, and I I really only eat snacks on like special occasions, like if I'm going to like a Super Bowl party or something like that at this point. Um, yeah, let's see. Golden Oreos, another good road trip snack too. Um, Next one. Let's see. Coffee, yes or no? I don't drink coffee. I did briefly for a few weeks when I first started my business, and I don't like the taste of it. I don't like the energy swings. And I have a lot of family members who didn't start drinking coffee um, until their 30s. And now they can't wake up without coffee. I don't want to be like my parents who can't wake up without coffee. I like the ability that I can actually wake up in the morning with a decent amount of energy without coffee, and I hopefully can maintain that my entire life. The one caffeinated beverage I do like is tea, but I generally only drink tea when I'm feeling like a little under the weather. For some reason, tea tastes a lot better when you're sick versus when you are healthy. The top three economic headwinds between now and 2030. The first one is just high cost of living and unaffordable housing market. The second one is public finance, or just the fact that so many national governments have way too much debt and are going to probably require severe austerity or inflation to pay them off. And then the third one is labor disruption from AI, or the bad quality education system not enabling people from being able to find the higher skilled jobs available. So those are the three disruptions. Let's see. Next question is there is talk about ending the income tax, and people said, and I used to make this argument too. It's like prior to 1913, the entire federal government was financed through tariffs and non-income tax. Yeah, that can work, but you need a 1913 size government because 40% of the tax revenues are income tax, and we already have a material deficit. So if you'd want to get rid of the deficit and get rid of that additional 40% of revenue, you would need to drastically cut the size of government to make that right. So that is kind of my take on the. I mean, I'd love it, but you would have to replace it with something else if you don't want to just get rid of every sort of entitlement. And I wouldn't be entirely against that, but I don't think the American people would want to get rid of every single entitlement and slash the military by over 50%. The next question, let's see. Best places to meet young professionals, friends, and communities in a new city. I have some experience with this because I've lived in several new cities. There's one is if you have existing friends, or if you have roommates you get along with, they introduce you to people. There also are affinity groups. Like for me, when I moved back here, I met a lot of new friends from being involved in my local chamber of commerce because it's mostly young entrepreneurs who are in there, and I was a young entrepreneur, so I made a lot of friends that way. I also went to certain social things, like I was in a tennis group. I got involved in my local Catholic young adult community. I got involved in the local CFA society, which is like a finance thing. And yeah, I made friends that way. And then you naturally meet friends from their friends and kind of develop a social circle. And there's also certain organizations that start social groups or social clubs in town. That might be fading, but it was a popular thing like right shortly after the pandemic when people just lost a lot of their friends due to people moving because of that or social isolation. But yeah, just getting involved in certain community things are probably the best way to do that. Yeah. And then and not all of them are, and the thing is that I read a good book. It was like, I forgot the name of it. It was Knockout Networking. It was written by a former boxer, I think, or a boxing coach. But one lesson is learned is the 2/3 rule. Like when you go out to a networking event or a party or a social event, you're not going to like 2/3 of the people there. If you connect with 1/3 of the people you talk to, you had it was well worth your while. You had a great time. But that generally does not. So if you don't get along with most of the people, the overwhelming majority of people there, don't take it personally. And a lot of people meet friends through their jobs, but the thing is with coworkers is that they're oftentimes your competitors for promotions and other things. So they may not be the most genuine friendships. So if you're working in say completely different departments or are not really on the same projects, then it's more likely to work in terms of coworker friends. And also they might be in different stages of life. Like when I worked at a big company or at least a larger company, most of my coworkers were 10 plus years older than me and were married with kids. And so they were just in a different stage of life and didn't have time to hang out with me. Do you think Puerto Rico will become a U.S. state, and what will be the economic political consequences of that change? I think it'll be very difficult. Problem with Puerto Rico becoming a state is threefold. One, there's the language barrier. And until English becomes the predominant language of Puerto Rico, it will be hard to sell it on becoming a state. The second is the political one. Puerto Rico is overwhelmingly has more left-wing populist politics. And as a result, it's the same reason why I don't think the U.S. won't annex Canada, is because if you do that, it's going to add 2 Democratic senators and probably 5 out of the 6. They're probably there's 3 million people and there's 7. So they'll add 4 members of the House, and probably 3 of them at least, if not all 4, will be Democrats consistently. And so that is probably a hindrance. Maybe if you had a deal where, for example, you brought in Puerto Rico and you split California in half for a more red California, that might be the way. So you even out the impact in the Senate. It has to be something like that. That's what happened with Alaska and Hawaii. Hawaii was anticipated to be the conservative Republican dominated state, and Alaska was anticipated to be the Democrat state. Yet with the discovery of oil in Alaska and the fruit plantations losing power in Hawaii, it actually ended up being the opposite. But that was what kind of helped the cases for those two being integrated into the U.S. And then the third issue is Puerto Rico's financial situation. They have a massive amount of debt. They already struggle in terms of having a competitive economy because their productivity is not justified matching the same minimum wage that the main U.S. has. And you have a lot of just different cultural and economic and regulatory and differences in terms of work ethic and vacation time and other things that just make it hard to set up business. And also the fact it's in a hurricane zone also puts it at risk too. And a lot of the more ambitious Puerto Ricans have already moved to the mainland United States, which kind of magnifies a lot of the problems. So I think the status quo is really going to be maintained for Puerto Rico, because I think they would lose out if they became independent because of a lot of the subsidies that the rest of the country gives them, whether directly or indirectly. But there's a lot of political barriers that I've mentioned for them becoming a state. And so, yeah, I didn't know if Puerto Rico had such a low birth rate. Maybe if Puerto Rico's population drops enough, then it may not be seen as a threat, but that's still the 2 Democratic senator problem. What are your thoughts on why poor countries stay poor? Yeah, I mean, I think it's because of of institutions. You have negative incentives built into a lot of these countries, and their cultures do not promote entrepreneurship or capitalist development or anti-corruption. So it's whether it's and so as a result, the combination of corruption or tall poppy syndrome or lack of education or lack of priorities for that, or weak business culture. There's a lot of things, but it's mainly cultural driven, because a lot of the places that were poor, once they adopted the right institutions, I'm mainly thinking of Northeast Asia and um, Eastern Europe post the fall of the Berlin Wall, were able to rapidly converge towards the developed economies. Whereas the countries that do not adopt these certain institutions, or just are too corrupt to implement them correctly, stay poor. So, yeah, I think that's really the answer. Thoughts on Peter Thiel? Um, I think Peter Thiel has been a net positive for the development of the conservative movement in the United States. And I think he makes a lot of valid, interesting points about innovation and politics and society. I watch a lot of his interviews on YouTube. He'd be somebody who I'd love to have as a guest on this channel too. Uh, him and Giannis Varoufakis are the two I've mentioned so far. But um, yeah, he does have a lot of power. I mean, I don't really, Palantir is kind of a black box, but it kind of shows like that his influence on foreign policy is probably somewhat influenced by how much the government uses it. But yeah, I don't think Peter Thiel is a net positive. Like, he is the one who changed along with Trump, changed conservatives in America from like the stodgy, like neocons of John McCain and George W. Bush to the more vibrant type of conservatism that we have now in this country. I have to give Peter Thiel a lot of credit for that. Let's see. Do I have any more questions? If I'm gonna probably be on here for another 15 minutes or so. So if you want to ask me a question, get it in. Otherwise, I am going to log out. But while I'm waiting for questions, I'll remind you guys, and you could scroll up on the to see, is that the tour is expanding. We are going March in Miami, Phoenix next week, in Texas, and in May to the Northeast US, DC, Philly, New York, and early June, Calgary. And we're going to do Europe in late August and early September. We have some other summer destinations, but it's too early for me to announce those within the United States. Vacation finance. What is the appropriate portion of take-home pay to spend on vacations? I generally use 2.5% gross income per year on vacations. So if you make $100,000 a year, you could spend two and a half grand on all your vacations for the year. That's how I budgeted it. It's enough that as your income grows, you can go on nicer vacations, but it's also financially sustainable. And it also, if you know what you can afford for vacations in advance, it can help you design trips that fit that budget. So that is what I would do. And you would be surprised how, if you do things the right way, you can actually have really nice vacations on very reasonable budgets. Yeah, is free healthcare actually plausible? No, it's not, because you can't really allocate. Like, the problem is with healthcare, you have unlimited wants but limited supply. You have to ration it somehow. You can ration it through either restricting who can get it at all. You can ration it by length of time, or you can ration it by cost. America has shown to rationalize it by cost. Like, if you will give it to anybody, but the price will go up as high as it needs to go to do it. Europe has decided that we'll make healthcare accessible to everybody at no cost, but we're not going to meet the demand, so it's going to have to be delayed the time, and or restrict who gets it. And then Canada, with MAID, is trying to basically reduce the amount of people who are eligible and be more cost effective with what they give it. And I'm opposed to MAID and similar things from a moral perspective, but those are the ways. There's a funny meme about this that is probably repeated on the internet. So yeah, you can't really have free healthcare. It's like you can't really have free housing either. There's no incentive to produce it if you don't. Like, So that's kind of everything has a cost. The next thing is I got from questions. Since this episode is economics of dating, do you have any advice for people who are curious about the institution of marriage from a finance or other social benefit point of view? Is it worth it? I did a debunking the doomer on marriage as the Valentine's Day special last year. And I argued in that video that I am for the institute. I think marriage does work. And what's it called? What's it called? Yeah, I just tested out the super chat goal thing to see if what it actually will work. But the point being is I was going to go back to the marriage thing. Yeah, I think generally marriage is a good thing in terms of the benefits it has from life expectancy and overall happiness and a healthy outcome to raise kids who will have better economic outcomes themselves. But when it comes to what was I going to say? When it comes to from a pure financial perspective on individual level, it really depends on your situation. I think that there's also tax benefits to getting married, but it's more importantly just like the fact that you have somebody who's going to go through the ups and downs of life with you and a stable family will just make your quality of life better. But watch my video for that specifically. If someone in college plans to do entrepreneurship tech, how would you recommend spending the remaining of their 20s? You spend 3 to 5 years working in the industry that you would want to start a product in. That will give you the time to build the right amount of experiences and connections needed to figure out what the need is just that the startup will provide, because there's no point of starting a startup if there's no demand for your product. And also, the other thing is you will also gain the skill set and the expertise to be credible when you're trying to raise money for investors or get your first clients on board. That's my advice. You graduate from college, put your 3 to 5, and maybe if you're in a more capital intensive industry, say like oil drilling, then you might need more time because you probably need to raise more money, and therefore you need more expertise. And the expertise is more advanced and complicated because you're dealing with a lot of heavy machinery. So that is my take on that. And then, yeah, thanks for the super chat, Dire Golden Mantis. Yeah, let's see. I'm going to scroll up here for some other questions. It seems like I have a lot more comments than questions on this one. I always read all of these after the live chat replay is available. So yeah, but like if it's a comment, I don't really know what the actual question really is. Next thing is all right. Do you think UBI is going to be a consequence of advancing technology or becoming political currency in the long run? I think that UBI, I've talked about this in several of my videos, is not really a solution here because there'll always be a relative problem. Like if you're trying to really just placate the masses who are unemployable, you're better off just plugging them into the metaverse matrix style. But there are ethical concerns for that too. I think that first of all, there'd be an inflationary impact. We saw this with like the pandemic unemployment benefits. If you give everybody a bunch of money in the stimulus checks, that's just going to be a net inflationary, and therefore just the price level will raise proportionately. The other thing is if you don't have the incentive for people to produce stuff, you're going to have less supply of goods in the same, if not more, demand, which is also inflationary. And it just creates also a lot of negative incentives. Like if the government is literally paying you a salary, which is what UBI essentially is, then you're going to incentivize to vote for politicians who will increase that salary. And that provides a lot of negative incentives that would otherwise mess up the economy. Okay. Opinion on the importance of looks for men. It's not as important as it is for looks for women generally. I think that I know plenty of people who are very good looking, but who struggle with dating because they are either have like a unattractive personality, whether it's just they're not likable or they have social awkwardness or on the spectrum or whatever it is. And whereas you see people who are not very good, stereotypically good looking, but do very well because of their career or their charisma or the Riz, as Gen Zs like to say, or other things. So I think it is a variable, but it is not the variable. Especially like the one thing that does seem to be very sensitive to is height to a certain degree, which is sad because really men can't really control that. But I've met plenty of people who are otherwise very average or below average looking who've done good at dating just because they're tall. Like, so it really can be a bunch of things, but I think I wouldn't be worried about it. I don't think looks maxing is a very smart strategy. You're better off just improving and developing yourself in terms of your career or your personal ambitions or becoming a more interesting person. Advice on making a monthly budget, allocating wages. You got to create a spreadsheet, step one, then list all your predictable costs and then figure out what's left over from there. But in general, in terms of allocations, I would say depending on whatever you have to pay in taxes, you have to pay in taxes. But for most middle-class people, it's about 25% is just kind of a proxy. So have that for taxes. I would target, and it depends on where you live. On higher cost of living, this might not be viable, especially early in your career, but lower cost of living, it could be easily done. You want about 25% towards housing costs, and then another 25% towards savings, and then the remaining 25% towards everything else. That's like an ideal budget. So like as your income grows, you'll be saving more, and you will also be able to increase the lifestyle, because like the FIRE idea of just living super austere and saving every extra penny is going to get old, and it might lead to, it's kind of like people who diet and starve themselves consistently, and once they get over it, they just splurge. FIRE is like the financial equivalent of that. So that is a something that I would factor in really there. And so, yeah, but at the same time, if you consistently inflate your lifestyle with your income, you'll never save, and you're going to be in trouble when it comes to retirement or building any meaningful wealth. So you got to have a balance. What would I put on my Mount Rushmore of economists? I'll probably think of a better answer for this after the live stream, but there are a few I can think of off the top of my head. Yeah, I'd probably put Adam Smith because he literally kind of was the one who formally invented the field. I would probably put Friedrich Hayek on there. I would probably put Milton Friedman on there. And let's see, who else would I put? Like I got my Austrian, I got my Chicago, I got Adam Smith. The fourth one is kind of the challenge, and I'd probably realize it after this live stream, but I guess I'd have to put Keynes, even if I don't agree with a lot of his stuff, because how influential he was in terms. That would probably be my Mount Rushmore. I particularly like Keynesianism that much. Or if you want to do purely just on impact, I'd probably do it'd be Marx, Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman. Adam Smith. Well, actually, Adam Smith should be on there too. So there's probably should be 5, like in terms of because important economist, or maybe I'd place Hayek with Adam Smith. The next one is, what do you think of Robert Kiyosaki's phrase "savers are losers"? I mean, I haven't read Robert Kiyosaki since Rich Dad Poor Dad when I was in high school, so I need some more context on that. But savers aren't losers if they invest their savings. How else do you build capital? Like, you can't, like, if you spend everything, then you're just going to be broke your whole life. So maybe it's just he thinks, oh, a saver who just puts in a savings account and doesn't invest, but that's not really smart. I don't really think anybody really does that. So do you see more people starting families but not getting married, or getting married and not registering with the government? Well, a lot of the churches will not approve of your marriage if you don't register with the government. So that is going to be somewhat of a deterrence. I think the problem with marriage is mainly in family formation. It's just the high cost of housing. If you had more affordable housing, people would get married quicker and have larger families. And a lot of men don't feel comfortable getting married until their finances are at a certain level, and a lot of that is indexed to housing costs. Yeah, that's my thoughts on this. All right, I think I'm gonna wrap it up here if I don't really have any more questions. Thank you guys all for joining. I actually, this was I guess people weren't as interested in this topic as I thought, but it was great to have all of you guys there. This is the last chance you're gonna get for the dating type topics, because I don't really want to answer those questions anymore. I've got a lot of other interesting content I'm going to move on to do. Yeah, thank you for watching, everybody.